Okay. Can everyone hear me? I think, yes, that's very loud. Thank you all for joining us right after lunch. We're here to talk about a topic that I think is kind of undersold a bit, because trade is a part of globalization, and globalization has kind of been the narrative of 2016 and the backlash of Trump and Brexit, and the rest of the world being angry that they were left out of the growth that had accrued to a small number of people. And so that kind of shapes the questions that I'm going to ask our panelists about A, how we screwed up so badly, and B, what we can do next. So, and I'll just go down the line. So there's a massive backlash against free trade and globalization right now. I'll just ask you, how did we screw up so badly?
You're asking me?
We're just going to go down the line.
Okay, so the way I think about it is this, is that the international trade system is an incredible accomplishment, given that humans have achieved something which is beyond any other species, which is to trust people beyond their immediate circle. And the entire international system is based on a massive system of trust in trade, in credit, and so on. But it's trust that has gone seriously wrong, and has gone wrong for the reason you mentioned, that the system does not appear to most people to be delivering to them.
Okay.
Well, look, I agree with you that there's definitely been some massive shortcomings. But the one thing I think people lose sight of is the fact that in many ways the system has been remarkably successful. When you think about the modern trade system that was put in place after World War II, it was put in place so we didn't have a repeat of what we had had over the previous couple of decades, which was World War I, Great Depression, World War II. So by that measure, you know, we've had a 70-year period that is unprecedented period of peace and prosperity. And I think the core question that you're getting at, which is the screw up, and I don't know if we have an answer to it, is that yes, it's been remarkably successful at a macro level, but you do have a situation where you have low-skilled, high-earning workers in developed economies have lost out to low-skilled, low-wage earners in developing economies, and there's been incredible downward pressure on wages of low-skilled workers in the developed world. And I don't know if we can go back to a world where a low-skilled worker in a developed economy is going to be paid what would be considered a global high income, because we now have a global labor market. And that's before you factor in pressures from technology, which I think are much greater than the pressure from low-income workers.
Yonov?
Well, thank you. I think we need to look at this from a point of view of narrative. And the narrative needs to reflect the whole concept of trade as a development policy tool. I think everybody agrees that even the developed countries of the world today use trade as a tool for development. However, the real challenge in the narrative is the fact that the benefits of trade have never ever been equally distributed across the world, both between countries and within countries. So as you go forward, you begin to see those who are being left behind, not because trade is not working, but largely because maybe due to domestic policy frameworks, some countries are losing competitiveness. And those sectors that lose competitiveness, definitely they lose jobs, they lose markets, they lose out in the environment, global environment. So I think what we need to be looking at now is not just the so-called anti-globalization or protectionist sentiments. We should also be talking about those who are really, as we speak, benefiting from trade, because there are success stories. So how do you change the narrative instead of getting the politicians who think because of domestic policy challenges, they will look for somebody to blame, and trade is usually the easy culprit.
Okay, let's try to reframe this. Let's try to get a little specific and kind of optimistic, because people are all here looking for some type of solution. Okay, so we're going to go down the line. The question is, if you were king, you're king of your country, no political opposition whatsoever, you could do the exact policy that you think would benefit the most amount of people. What would it be in relation to trade? What do you think it would accomplish? And give us an example of something that you've seen that would give you hope in what it could do.
Well, I'm sorry to say I think it would be exactly the wrong way to look at it. The problem is not one of, or the problem has been that people feel there are people in authority telling them what to do and what's good for them. And the underlying problem now is how we build a narrative into which people can buy in. And that means the narrative has to relate to where people actually are. I agree about inequality, but of course inequality is a very complicated notion because it's always relative. So the problem is how to keep on board people in different parts of the world, in different countries, so that they all can work together to the good of everyone. And so to try and answer your question, I would say that we really need to understand and be much more straightforward about the problems, and we almost certainly have to deal with the fact that the system at the moment is massively unfair, and unless we, for example, fix tax avoidance, I see no way forward.
Yeah.
Okay, same to you. I may come back to that because that was a kind of a partial answer of my question. For you, if you were king, you could do anything you want. What is the most that trade can do? What would you do? What can it accomplish? Give us some hope.
Well, this is not going to be hopeful. I think the problem is that even if you're king of your country, trade by definition is a global issue. So you have issues that you just touched on, which is tax avoidance. That is something that even if you're the king of America, and look, I had the pleasure of serving in the White House for President Obama, and I can assure you that that's not how it works. There's just a limited set of tools in your toolbox, and if you are the king of a country, you're going to have to say, how do I make my country more competitive? And I think a lot of the ideas around making their country more competitive are backwards looking. They want to refight the last war. But I think there's a whole set of looming problems that we face going forward that would even make, if you were a king, you would have even less tools at your disposal. Because in the past, where, yes, we might have moved factories over to other places, that trade has run its course. What you're going to have in the future is where the means of production are all over the place and oftentimes 100% automated. And then you'll have the workers, the high-skilled workers, that'll be distributed all over the world. And they'll be able to, if you're a doctor, say, and you're a highly skilled doctor in Chicago, Illinois, where I live, you'll be able to engage in work all over the world without ever having to leave Chicago. So there's this whole other set of problems that are looming on the horizon that we haven't even begun to discuss.
And so is your argument then that there isn't much to do through trade? It's all domestic policy which can handle these problems, and trade just kind of needs to run its course?
Well, I would say that domestic policy is really the only tool that we have, and then you have coordination between countries. So I think you have to engage in both, but what we would do in the U.S. if I were a king, and you're working on building up skills and other things like that, well, you also have to be engaging the rest of the world around issues like tax avoidance and other things. So I think there's a real limitation as to what you can do as a nation state or as the leader of a nation state.
Okay, that's two kind of avoiding questions, but it gives us a framework. All right.
Well, I think for any country, whether you are developing, or least developed, there is no one-size-fits-all as to how you benefit from trade. So you need to first be clear on what your development objectives are and priorities. It is based on your economic and political circumstances and your priorities that you begin to devise the means of benefiting from trade, whether it is strictly through multilateral rules of the WTO and the multilateral trading system, or through regional trade agreements where you are working with like-minded partners, or you are looking at bilaterals on a country-to-country basis, in which case you can easily see where you need to reform, how to reform, and how long the reforms will take. So the issue here is, how does governments, together with their different stakeholders have a trade policy governance structure at the national level where everybody knows what is happening, when the reforms will take place, what kinds of adjustments they will need, the support the government needs to give to them, the laws that need to be changed. You need to have all this going on at the same time, because as we look through history, the landscape for trade has continued to change. Before we were talking of border measures, tariffs, and standards. Today, those are not the issues.
Right.
We are looking at intellectual property protection, investment regimes behind the border measures. So how the governments think together with the stakeholders to retool their policy making means is the key for me.
Okay, let's try this another way. This is good, but a little abstract. Everyone, going down the line, give me one example, one concrete example of something that a government has done, or a trade organization, or a multinational organization, or the United Nations, or someone has done that you think solved a problem. What was that problem, and can we do more of it?
Well, so I think, for example, the European Union, in theory, tries to create standards for products and standards for the way in which things are produced. And I think this actually is a very important way forward, although many people oppose it. So in my view, the way forward is to have much more dialogue in which people understand the benefit of cooperation, and that cooperation is going to have to be based on a guarantee of rights that
Okay, but
people
in
have.
the entirety of trade policy universe,
I think it's...
and one example that in your mind has as some kind of uniformity of the way products were produced, why was this a good thing?
I think that has. I think the standardization of...
But how did it, what were the actual benefits?
Well, the benefit is that people know what they're buying, and producers know what they've got to produce, and workers feel properly treated.
Okay, great.
So, I mean, like, I'll give one example that we did when I was in the Obama administration was we had this view that, you know, if you want to increase your country's competitiveness, you need to increase the skills of your labor. And so what we did was we realized government couldn't do it all on its own, and that we've had these government training programs in the past. They've sort of fallen short of what they needed. So we put in place processes where you had the private sector businesses partnering with community colleges that were receiving funding from the government, so that way they could train their people that were oftentimes later in their careers with the skills that the employer needed, and then the people who were in that training program would be able to leave and go into a job that existed in their communities. And that was because you had the business people saying, we need to fill these jobs. We can't fill them because the potential employee pool doesn't have the right skill set.
Hold on. So I like this. I'm going to push back on you because I've been reading a whole bunch about worker retraining programs, and everything that I read is that worker retraining programs, especially when they're done in partnership with governments, just do not work. A lot of times the seats sit empty,
Yes.
No one fills them up, and then when they finally do get the job, the next job that they do doesn't pay even close to what their previous wage was. So either tell me that it doesn't work, or did you find one that actually worked?
No. What you're saying is right. So that was our view. We said, instead of the government saying, here, we're going to train you in these jobs, we're going to train you how to be a buggy whip maker. Instead, what we would do is we would say to the private sector, you have these jobs that are unfilled. What skills do the employees need to fill those jobs? They would say what it was, and we would say to the community college, okay, you have all these resources to train workers. We want you to work with the employers to build out a training program that will allow that to work.
And can you give us a specific region, a company, an organization, a name of did that?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example.
And what happened?
So I'll give you an example that we have in Chicago right now. There's this great organization called Skills for Chicagoland's Future. It was created by Obama's Commerce Secretary, Penny Pritzker, before she went in to be Commerce Secretary. She did it in partnership with the federal government, where she personally put up money, and then she went out and she got partners in the business community. And then what they would do is they would match the Chicago community colleges with these businesses, and the businesses would oftentimes adopt a specific community college, and they would say, I'm the business, I'm Motorola Solutions, I need a certain set of these technical skills that aren't being fulfilled. We will partner with this community college in Chicago. we'll put up some of the money, the government will put up some of the money, and then any student who goes through that program and gets certified has an automatic job at Motorola Solutions.
Okay, I like that. That's a good example. I'm going to come back to it because I still have a lot of questions on it, but I want to give Yonov a...
Yeah, I have my good example of how trade works is in the textile and clothing industry or sector. Because it also explains the challenges we have with the narrative today. You know, the textile sector is low-skilled, mass production. And it tends to go only where wages are low. So with the multi-fiber agreement, when it was phased out in the WTO, it opened up markets. So you ended up with countries that were less competitive, even least developed countries going into garment manufacturing. Or even if you look at countries like Vietnam, countries like Bangladesh, or even when the US introduced the African Growth and Opportunity Act, Agah, with apparel benefits, a country like Lesotho, which had no textile and garment sector, was able to build a garment sector that was now exporting, providing jobs. And the issue here is that based on the value chains in the garment industry, it goes right down to the farmer who produces cotton to the garment. So I think this tells us that if you look at even the garment industry, when your wage rates become too high, you become uncompetitive and you lose the industry. That doesn't mean trade is bad. It's just because you have lost competitiveness. And this can be applied to any other sector.
So take that, the garment industry, downward pressure on wages, uncompetitive industries and businesses get wiped away, the beauty of destructive capitalism. What is an example of a response that a government did in relation to that helped people?
Well, if as you would observe, when governments had basic manufacturing with low skills, the income levels went up, the economies grew. And then different new skills and sectors started opening up. And this is where education policy becomes key. So it's like graduation.
Yeah.
If you lose competition in low skills, you have to be competitive in high-tech goods. And we have seen this in China, we've seen this in Taiwan, we've seen it in Japan. So it's a global experience from economic history.
Yeah, but a lot of people are left out, and then they get pissed off, and then they elect people who shut down trade agreements. And this is what we're seeing now. So the question is, assuming that's a good thing, you have economic growth, money going towards developing countries who absolutely deserve it, how do you help the people who are left behind? So let's go back to your...
Can I just make one final point on this?
Sure, go ahead.
I think sometimes you listen too much to the rhetoric. Many of what you hear today does not translate to reality based on the monitoring reports that the WTO does for the G20 countries based on protectionist measures that countries have taken. To the contrary, our reports show that most countries have taken more trade liberalizing measures than protectionist measures, in spite of all that you hear. So that I think we need to separate the rhetoric from the reality on ground.
Well, and also I think a lot of the rhetoric about lost jobs because of trade, in the U.S., people will blame, Mexican workers, Chinese workers. The reality is a lot of those jobs are lost to technology, right? Because these industries are becoming more competitive. They're not becoming more competitive because they've outsourced jobs. They're becoming more competitive because they're investing in technology and automation. And the reality is that, I grew up in a factory town, and a lot of those jobs are now done by robots. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if we can, my grandfather spent 42 years on an assembly line, and it was a really hard job. And what we often conflate is the middle class lifestyle that he was able to provide, which allowed my dad to be the first in his family to go to college, and the job itself. So we should be talking more about how do we make sure people can live a middle class life and have a job that has dignity, and less about the specific loss of jobs, because that wasn't the best use of my grandfather's human capital, sitting there doing a square peg in a square hole in a dirty, noisy, dangerous factory. And so I think we need to separate those two, and then also realize that okay, when we separate those two, understand that this job over here wasn't lost because of trade. This job was lost because of technology, and that's actually a good thing.
Okay, so I will push back on that, and that's wonderful. So I think it was an economist named, MIT economist named Darren Acemoglu that looked at what the differences between technology and trade. And trade, of the 11 million jobs that were lost over the last decade to manufacturing, I think 2.2 million of them were due to economic shocks from China. So we know it's a smaller portion of what technology did, but that's still like 2 million jobs and 2 million pissed off people. And so when we take them through this Chicago-style retraining program, then they get a job, but it pays substantially less.
That's not always the case.
Substantially less. On average, that's what they found, about a 20% dip in pay. So on median, people are worse off. So how do we fix that problem? Because if we don't, then a lot of people, for most, trade is just bad.
Well, I think it depends on, the industry they go from, right? And I think it also depends, the big thing here is also the geography, right? Where are these happening? If it's in Chicago, there's a lot of different jobs and different sectors that you can move into. Oftentimes those sectors are higher up on the value chain, so you can move into a job that still pays, $70,000, $80,000. But if it's a place like where I grew up, yeah, there isn't another job to absorb them, so people have to move.
Okay, so but that's a solution. And I will ask the panel, do people, in response to trade, do people just need to move? We need to tell them your town just isn't that economically productive anymore. You need to go to a big city. Is that the policy we should have?
No.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, you can do that to some extent in a place like the US. People have, historically, that's what they've done, moved. But I think in general, all this produces fundamental problems about what we think society is going to do and what work is going to be about. And I think we're a long way from doing it because we need a narrative which people can actually buy into. Otherwise, we're just going to get negative and unhelpful narratives which often go in the opposite direction of what we want.
But narratives are based on, narratives are based on thing. And if what you're saying is that some people are just exist in a region that just isn't that economically productive, is the new narrative, and say, have the pioneer spirit and go to another city.
Well, that's not, that won't work.
Okay, then what do we do for the people who are getting jobs that are now 20 to 30% less in wages?
But look, the fact is there are a huge number of things that societies need to be done. Healthcare, numerous infrastructure problems that places are falling apart, numerous things that need doing. So we currently have a problem of actually getting people to do the things that we need done. So it's not just a trade problem. And in fact, the automation problem is going to force people to deal with this, but it may go through a lot of conflict first.
So what I'm hearing there is that trade opens up all these inefficiencies, but governments do have lots of things that people can do that are potentially high-paying. We just haven't married them. This is kind of what you're saying. That's a lovely idea. I don't know.
I think sometimes there is a misconception about trade policy. Trade policy is not really about trade. Trade policy is about your technology policy, your industrial policy, your agricultural policy, your educational policy, your health policy. So when you take the best that works for your people from all these, that's when you now say you have a trade policy. So when you simply focus attention on the exchange of flows between countries, you miss the point. And I think that is why I think anybody who is benefiting from trade today needs to speak out, because the reforms that governments need to think out when they run into trouble based on changing economic circumstances is not what we are seeing. Rather, it's the blame game. And you blame, you fall behind, you lose momentum, the people suffer more, and the cries come up more, and you end up with some of the rhetorics that we have today.
Okay, so then what I'm hearing is that trade really isn't a thing. It's everything else, and that is trade. Like, you have your domestic policy, you have your healthcare policy, you have your education policy, you have your infrastructure, and all the different ways you give them jobs, and that's pretty much. So if you're screwing up those things, then trade's just going to exacerbate everything that else is going on. This is what I'm hearing. Am I misinterpreting this?
Well, I would want to say, if you get some of these policies wrong, trade goes out of the window. He loses. If you focus mostly on it's not a business deals, one-on-one business deals between businessmen. When you think, oh, I got this, or I screwed him, or he screwed. This is a win-win situation. If there is growth, for instance, I was in Portugal in last 1998 for the Lisbon Expo. The country has changed since then. I can't even recognize Lisbon. And what is it? Maybe Portugal joining the EU enabled it to trade more and grow. That is reality. Those are the kinds of stories we need to be telling people as to the opportunities trade creates and the thinking that goes into economic policy and development.
Look, I think that's right, because I think there's this aspect where, yes, there's shortcomings, and we do have to address those, and you and I were talking about some of them backstage. You undoubtedly have to address those. But the alternative can't be, well, let's just rip up the system and see what happens, because we actually know what happens. We saw it during the interwar period. We'll have bigger-than-ever policies by each country looking out for their own citizens, and they'll sell their citizens a lot of populist, nationalist economic policies. We know they don't work, and then we end up with a situation that is much, much worse than what we have right now. And I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. This, our trade structure and arrangement that has existed since World War II has been a remarkable success. It has its shortcomings, and we have to think about how do you address those shortcomings. But when we think about the shortcomings, if it's framed as this, how do we get into a world where a low-skilled worker in a developed economy is going to be paid global wages that are considered high? I think that's really, really tough.
Okay, so then we have all these millions of workers who were displaced by trade. So one option that we heard the panel say is that we can retrain them, but on average their wages are going to be about 20% lower, and their town may not survive. What other things can we do to people who are displaced by trade?
Well, look, I think you need to think about it from, there's a couple different ways to think about it. One is, what is the age of the worker who's been displaced? And, you have to have a certain set of policies for, people who are displaced today. And you also have to have a set of policies that address, the human capital of your country going forward. And we know what we need to do going forward, right?
No, we don't. I mean, this audience may not know. They may know. What do you think we need to do? That's what I'm asking.
Well, we need to have a highly educated population. That is the main thing. Is you need to educate.
That's like a broad solution. I mean, one of them is government, the corporate partnerships that you did with the Obama administration, and the business.
That addresses the guy who just lost his job, and I agree. And so that's what I'm saying is there's a way to address that, and then you have the other way, which is how do you address this thing, which is a multi-generational approach, right? And the multi-generational approach, it's not going to get you elected politically. Because, the 8-year-old who now has...
but hold on. What does a multi-generational approach mean? What is it specific?
What's the type of education we invest in our young
talking like
people?
K through 12 education investment.
K through 12. What does community college look like? What does technical training look like? And you don't have to lay out the curricula for 20 years from now. But it's a certain level of investment, and it has to constantly evolve. So there is no solution that a policymaker can put forward today and say, well, this is a thing we'll do for the next 20 years. But rather, it has to evolve over time. And then you have another issue, which is then you're addressing the worker who's out of work today.
Okay, so then that's one. So on this panel in the last 27 minutes, we've heard retraining, which can work to some degree. Are there any non-educational or non-training solutions that we should think about in relation to trade?
Well, I think there is one other thing we haven't really brought up, which is it's not really about nations, this. It's about groups within nations, much more than it used to be, partly because of the connectedness of the whole situation. So I think we do have to look at redistributive solutions which somehow people can buy into.
Redistributed, that means taxing rich people and giving the money out.
Not necessarily giving it away, taxing rich people and using it to build up, for example, lifelong educational systems.
This comes back to education. Do we have any I'm just going to ask the panel, non-educational solutions to trade, or are education ones the only thing we should be looking at?
And high-quality living environments where, the actual quality of the environment, which is common, is of a higher quality.
What does that mean?
It means all sorts of things, not just gated communities, but the whole of society being a place that is much more what people want to live in. There are all
What does
kinds
that
of
look like in a
examples.
policy, like a high quality living? How does the government make a place a high quality living?
Well,
Just one
if you
specific thing.
you having public sports grounds, public this, public the other, public parks, public systems.
So
for
nice
enjoy-
urban design.
Yeah.
Nice urban design. Okay, so we have high taxes, redistribution, education, nice urban design.
Well, and I think, infrastructure is an obvious one,
Yeah.
right? That's
Infrastructure.
And I say that as somebody who invests in infrastructure, but I think that's an obvious one. But I think there is this other component where all these policies, instead of thinking about all these policies around the means of production, which I think it's how we've used to think about it, you almost need to reorient the policies and put the people at the center. And I know that sounds like, well, what does that mean? But it means that you actually think about your infrastructure as oriented towards people. So you think about the park, you don't say, let's put a factory. I live in downtown Chicago. We do not need factories in the city of Chicago, right? What we need is park space. We need access to schools, things like that. And our city's done a great job of that. But yeah, it's unfortunate that the factories are no longer there, but that's actually a good thing because where that factory was is now a parkland. And so I think because a lot of these decisions were made in an industrialized economy, well, going forward, production will be highly automated. So we should think more about what is the area where the people are going to live and what should that look like, and infrastructure plays a major role in that.
This is the nice solution. So we project forward into the future. We're going to say those buildings aren't going to be there. They're not going to have much economic value. Let's turn it into a park where people can play, and then someone can keep the grounds, and that's a job.
Yeah, because it's all about investing in human capital, right? I mean, and my grandfather growing up and going to a one-room schoolhouse, leaving the farm to go do square peg, square hole, you didn't require a lot of investment in human capital. This is a whole other approach that's much more nuanced and much more ongoing.
Got it. Okay, so we are out of time. I hope everyone found this panel educational. Feel free to come up to the speakers afterwards. Thank you for joining us.
Well,
Sorry, I took your